CSS becomes an append-only language quite easily. What's the best way to get around it? Just put it at the bottom of the file. Tailwind's really useful for prototyping, for determining what are the components going to be, using that prototype that you've built with a framework like that, and then saying, okay, this is going to help us now make decisions on writing the actual production level CSS code. This isn't the finished product. This is going to be maintained. So that's where the methodology steps in, because it gives you that guardrail that you need. Because CSS itself doesn't give you any of that for free. It's a low-level language.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Modern Web Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Ocel, VP of Innovation at This.Labs, joined by my very favorite co-host, Danny Thompson, the Director of Technology at This.Labs. Danny, how are you doing?
I'm here. I'm excited. I think this is going to be a good one. I love the topic. Obviously, if you read the episode already, you know what the topic is going to be. But I think this is going to be a good one.
Yeah, I mean, and as the time that we're recording this, it is September. So, this is a 2025 goals alert. If you're like me and you haven't even set your goals for the year, maybe just skip this year. That's what I'm deciding. I'm just skipping 2025. I'm going to start getting ready for 2026 instead. I'm tired of being behind. I don't know. How you doing, Danny? You set for your goals for this year?
I'm always set. I've definitely hit some big goals already earlier on this year that I'm pretty proud of. I still have the rest of the year. We obviously have the tech conference coming up, which I'm super excited about, but we also have other things that we're kind of making happen. We have some initiatives in our local community. We just got the brand new website out of the Dallas Software Developers website, which I'm super excited about. We've been messing around with a lot more very concise and focused, like CSS principles, and of course making sure that the website is easy for anyone to kind of contribute to, because we want to keep it open source, and so that's been like a really fun thing to do. But another thing that I'm doing, it's like, I guess, like a new goal. I guess during like the holiday break, I always kind of tinker around, and so I'm messing with the idea of like potentially trying to dive into like making my own design library. And the thing is, it's just been fun. I've been having a blast, and especially like doing weird things to try and like make bundle sizes the way that you want to make them. That's been so fun, and so I've really it's been enjoyable time. So looking forward for the rest of this year, but I know whatever I hit, it's just bonus points at this point.
Well, talking about designs and goals, we get to cross something off our bucket list here and talk about CSS with Andy Bell. Andy is the founder of Piccalilli Set Studio, also an educator and a public speaker, just an all-around good person. Andy, how are you doing today?
Hey, hi, yeah, good. Thanks for having me on. This is exciting.
Yeah, do you have your goals in place for 2025? You doing well so far?
I think I had some goals, and then the year has not quite gone as everyone sort of planned it to go, I don't think, as it's there's been a lot of handbrake turns and gear shifts, but yeah, we'll get there. I think I'm the same as you, Rob. It'll be a 2026.
All right, let's just cut this one out, right? Yeah, let's just start fresh on top of it. Let's get to inbox 0 by just hitting mark all as read. We won't actually read them. If it was important, they'll send another email, right?
Yeah, if you emailed me in 2025, then that's
forget it.
Yeah.
Well, Andy, one of the first things that we wanted to talk to you about is just that, like, we love your passion for CSS. I think each of us is passionate about it in our own way, and I think it is just an awesome topic. And I'm just curious, I guess, to start out with, which is just, why is this the topic that gives you so much passion and that enables you to just keep coming back to it as both an educator, content creator, and a professional?
So by trade, I'm a designer. So I started off as a designer, and I only started learning CSS and HTML because I got annoyed that people weren't building my PSDs properly. So I used to get these links back from developers, and I'd find all these problems with it, and I just one day said, I'm going to learn CSS myself and do this and like make these adjustments myself. And then I just started getting into front-end development from there, and now I do way more front-end than I do design. In fact, I think I've forgotten how to do design completely these days. So yeah, so that's why I'm so into CSS, because as I see it, it's a design language, and it speaks to a creative brain more than other programming languages do.
So this is one of these things that we've had a couple topics on the podcast recently which flew along the lines of maybe social media has changed, maybe we as a community has changed, but one of the things that I remember from 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago was we used to have something that we would do in our interviews where we said, like, how would you rate your CSS knowledge? Like on a scale of like 0 to 10, whatever, being an expert. And what used to always be the thing that people would say is, well, I'm not like a 10 because I'm not those people that can make medieval art using CSS. And like, I was thinking recently, that's a reference I have not seen much anymore. Like, it used to be a fun medium to play with CSS to like really push yourself to see what you can create. Like, do you think that drive is still present in the community? Has that joy died out a little bit, or is it just that, with social media, that's just not rising to the top of the algorithms?
I think it's the former, the latter. Sorry, because I curate a newsletter for Piccadilly, and what I put at the end of every single issue is a link to a cool demo or a link to a cool code pen, and I see a hell of a lot of CSS art still, like really good CSS art. I just think, because social media is so fragmented now, you got Twitter, you got Blue Sky, Mastodon. I think it's hard for people to get on the timeline quite like you could do in Twitter's heyday. So yeah, I think it's more that than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing that like I just want people to play more. Mm-hmm. I think we spend so much time asking what the best way to do something is. What's the thing I have to learn to get the next, to get the next position to move up? And I do want to celebrate and see more of just people enjoying their tools. Yeah,
and there's definitely like correct ways to do things, and there's like better ways of doing things. But I always like to paraphrase Rachel Andrew, and she says, "If it works, it's right," and that's such good advice to run with, because there's so many different ways of doing things with CSS. I did an article a couple of weeks ago about centering in CSS, and like it was like 2,500 words, because there's just so many different ways you can do it, and it's all about making decisions and thinking about how it scales, and thinking about like your teammates and how what will this CSS look like when someone comes to look at it in 6 months, And so I agree. I think by playing with CSS, you learn all of the weird things that it does, and you learn like its limitations and what it's good at and what it struggles with. And then when you come to applying it to like a standard UI, which we all do day to day for our jobs, the comfort level will be much higher, and you'll understand like the limitations of like grid and flexbox and what better decisions to make based on that. So yeah, I agree. Play with CSS. Push it to its limits, and then you can really understand the language and how it works.
Well, I think a lot of times too, I mean, you tell me about this, but when I was the deepest in my experience of working with CSS, I was working with like an almost on the metal type of web app. It wasn't really using much of a framework. It was using web components, and we were really, really at the like edge of what the browsers could do. And that was one of the more exciting times in front end dev for me, is like when you start getting good enough with CSS that you not only are aware of, but like know how to move around browser inconsistencies. Like not the biggest ones that everybody knows, but like really in the weeds. If you've ever gotten to the point on one of your projects where you logged a browser bug based on your knowledge of the interactions of either CSS or something about the rendering framework, like that is exciting to me. Yeah. Like that's a place of mastery that I think like all teams should have somebody, because there can be some tricky CSS stuff that comes up. Just in those edges between the differences of browser, rendering of different properties.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for like what's a linear way of getting really good as a developer, like what's an A to B methodology of doing that, it's understanding how the browser works. Like, so understanding how the browser parses CSS, understanding how it builds the DOM from HTML, and understanding how it parses JavaScript too, make you a hell of a lot more like powered to write good code, because you understand how it works, like you say, on the metal. Like if you understand that, the code you're going to write is going to be a hell of a lot more efficient, and just like less bugs, less breakages, because you really understand how everything works. And we're lucky now, browsers are a lot more consistent than they used to be, especially when I started. IE6 was still hanging around in those days, and you used to have like specific styles for specific browsers at one point as well, but now it's so much easier to write code, but there's so much more to understand now about how browsers work, which I think is often a sort of forgotten skill now in the web, and really understanding how things move is it really does give you superpowers.
We'll be back to the episode in a second, but first I'd like to acknowledge the team behind the channel, This.Labs. We're seeing 3x to 5x productivity improvements with our teams and clients using tools like Cursor, Claude Code, and GitHub Copilot. We help teams adopt these technologies and get max value out of them through strategic partnerships, trainings, and other software engineering services. Check us out at ai.thisdot.co. Thanks. Now back to the video.
You know, it's funny. When I was doing some research for this conversation as a whole, I came across an article, and I didn't know if we were going to even be able to talk about it, but you kind of have. And I came across something that you wrote, and it was around being the browser's mentor instead of its micromanager. And since, our core theme of today is going to be around modern CSS, one element of that was modern CSS of 2022. What do you think has changed since then? It's been 3 years. Do your views still remain the same on that? Have they evolved? Has there been new changes that have come out within the last 3 years alone that has totally changed perspective on how teams are dealing with this?
So a lot has changed in 3 years. We've had a lot more stuff in the browser, but I've always had a principle of, like you said, be the browser's mentor, not its micromanager. And the main thing I'm saying with that is set some bounds for the browser. Let's give it a rule set, so and some guidance of how you want things to be. Don't force it to do anything, because it's better than you at working things out based on its context and user device, connection speed, all that stuff. So and the sort of core approach, as I see it, is progressive enhancement. Like CSS, presume everything's going to break, because it probably will. You never know what Chrome extensions someone's got installed, for example. You don't know what network elements are being blocked by. They might have a Pi hole or something that's blocking certain requests. There's all these variable things. The browser's a really hostile environment when you think about it. So if you approach things of, look, this is what I want you to do. If you can't do it, it's all good. If you work out the layout for yourself, this is what ideally I want, but if you need to snap and stack things on top of each other, it's all good. And so if you approach all modern CSS, even the brand new stuff, with that mindset of, it's probably not available, but I'm going to declare it, because CSS, the browser will just ignore CSS essentially, that it doesn't understand. So if you build up in layers, then you can use the shiniest, newest stuff straight away. And then when the browsers catch up to it, which they do a hell of a lot faster now than they used to do, then everything will just work. So yeah, it's all about that, taking a step back and appreciating the browser for what it's good at, and then applying that to your methodology of writing the code. You'll almost certainly find that you'll write less of it, and it'll be a lot simpler as well.
Across development, I think we have entered an era, maybe we've always been in an era, where we are trying to reduce the complexity. It just feels like there's so much to learn from all facets of design to security to performance, etc. And so we've done a lot of work to build frameworks that try to obscure the messiest edges of a lot of those things for the general developer group. And, maybe that's been partly behind the push for things like Tailwind to kind of simplify some of the rough edges. I guess my question for you as an educator, both how do you approach it, how do you teach it, but also what are your thoughts on the fact that CSS has so many things like the vendor prefixes and things like that, which are just things you have to know? They don't necessarily, or maybe you can defend them on an architectural principle, but they're not ways that you teach people to think in styles necessarily, but it's things you have to learn to be effective. So how do you contextualize that? Is that a good thing for CSS generally, that's still a big part of people's day to day? And how do you approach teaching that?
So my preference with teaching CSS is to have a wink towards stuff like that, like vendor prefixes, because tooling can do that for you a lot of the time. Rather than you having to be 100% aware of it, you can use post CSS or even Sass to generate that stuff for you. Really, what my focus is with teaching to try and create more evergreen content is focus on the standards. Focus on the stuff that's actually standard. A lot of vendor prefix stuff came from browsers experimenting with ideas, and then they stuck a vendor prefix on it, which is like a safety mechanism. And it was also mostly around browsers not fully agreeing with each other on how to do certain things. So old people like me will remember flexbox. Microsoft had a different way of doing flexbox than the other browsers did, so we had to use processing to generate those rules. My advice to people is always stick to the standards, follow the discussions as well in the working groups and stuff, because you'll learn a hell of a lot about how this CSS stuff comes together and the decisions that get made to do that. So it all comes down to the same thing. It's understanding. It's understanding the context, understanding the environment. Like if you're a game developer, what's like one of the primary things you need to understand is the environment that you're developing that game for and where it's going to be used, whether that's Xbox, PlayStation, or whatnot. It's the same thing with building for the web too. Just like with designers, understanding stock and finish. Like in web design, you need to understand how the browser works if you're a designer in web design, because you need to understand what the limitations are. So understanding the history, understanding how browsers make decisions and how people in those browsers make those decisions, it really does help you gain that overall sort of skill set and understanding those sort of like core skills that you need to be a really good developer.
I mean, just to elaborate on that, you mentioned like it helps you with some of the core skills to be a better developer. What are some of the other core skills that you think people should be trying to improve or grow within, given that?
So I'm hugely into this. So I did a course last year called Complete CSS, and yeah, we do a lot of CSS in that course, but the first sort of 35-40% of the course is me actually teaching people how to talk to each other, how to communicate with each other, how to deliver feedback, how to receive feedback. And so the context is we're working with a designer. The designer's not got any experience in web. So the first iteration of the designs that she delivers are like really look incredible, but like you look at it and you're like, I can't build that, I can't build that, I can't do that. So then we work through that with the designer to create these iterations, and then so that the core skill from that is simplification being like one of the most important ones. Like you can look at design and be like, I want to build this as a challenge, but then in your job, your responsibilities go further than that. Your responsibility is to create scalable code. Your responsibility is to create maintainable code and to work within the team. So the most efficient way of doing that is to simplify the starting point as much as you can for yourselves, and then you build off that simpler, smaller footprint to start with. You're not introducing as much technical debt. You're not writing code that when you're writing it, you're like, this is going to break, if something blows on this. And so that's one of the things I'm really, really into, is that like communication methodology and learning how to be asynchronous, learning how to not take things personally and also not make things personal for the people, and being objective. So like that's what's really important to me. Developers often don't think that's an important skill, but it applies to more than just CSS. It applies to any language. It applies to any working environment. If you're a better communicator, then you're going to do better in your job in the long term, especially if you want to progress and eventually like move into like management leadership roles. Like if you can't communicate well, you're not going to do well in that world. So learning to do it from the offset is really important, really, really crucial as I see it.
I love that. And I love that too, that, let's not call it soft skills, but like critical, foundational skills. I mean, one of the ones that I've seen as one that is not trained as much on the job, and it's one that we maybe used to expect that you would get in college, and we see either less of it, or because there's more ways to come into the career, you don't see it as much, and that is the ability to create an argument and to analyze an argument. Yeah. Which I found to be the foundational basis for communication, as you just said, but also the foundational basis for debugging, for understanding how a piece of software works or why it doesn't work. The amount of times I've sat down with people and say, what does this code think should happen? And what actually does it do? And I found a lot of people have not ever had the experience of critically analyzing either text or code or anything, or an argument for that matter. And I love this idea of there being really critical skills that you need, like communication, to be effective as an engineer.
Yeah, it's really useful skill, and like you say, it does apply to the other facets of our job as well. And opening your brain to a different way of thinking is really useful, just to make your life easier. when you're a developer or designer, or both.
Maybe maybe people live this, so we don't need to go into it too deeply. But what I wanted to do for a second was talk about what happens when we don't learn CSS. Do you have fun stories that you like to tell from the horror stories you've seen? You don't have to name names, but just what happens when teams don't respect this as a skill on their teams, as far as what kind of problems either they or their users eventually face?
So I used to do a lot of CSS consultancy, and I think one of the biggest problems was when you've got a team that are not 100% CSS proficient or even slightly. So say you got a team of full stack engineers, and their primary focus is not the front end; it's middle layer and the back end, and they'd lean into a framework with Bootstrap or Tailwind or any of them, doesn't matter. The reliance on that often created an append only environment for the front end. So the problems that they consistently fell into was, we want to progress and we want to move forward and we want to do features, but we're getting constantly being slowed down by the user interface, like the CSS especially. And they describe it as a CSS, but they're not writing CSS, they write an abstraction of that CSS. So they'd be writing utility classes, or they'd be implementing X, Y, and Z from different components of Bootstrap. And then so often they'd have a style sheet which was just a mess, just copied and pasted code from Stack Overflow, just anything to force the front end to do what they needed it to do. So that lack of education from them, it really was taking a high interest loan for themselves. They were constantly adding technical debt to an already heavily debted code base to start with. And it got to the point where they had to rely on someone like myself to come in with fresh eyes. And more often than not, with these CSS consultancy gigs, obviously the CSS was in better shape when we left. More often than not, I didn't tell them to stop using the framework. It was, let's use it with more of a knowledge-based approach instead. Understand what this is doing, understand how this is helping. But then back to the core skills, more often than not, that's what I left by teaching these people, because I used to be a bit of a detective. I'd say, give me your Slack access, give me GitHub access. I want to read all the bugs. I want to read all of the conversations. I want to read everything. And so often I pin down and be like, you're not talking to each other properly. You're not communicating well with each other, and you're not giving feedback properly. You get developers who be like, yeah, looks good, when they get a sketch or a Figma file. And then several weeks later, when they actually got to work on it, they'd find loads of problems, but they'd find those problems and talk about it between them in the dev channel. And it's well, you're not speaking to the actual people that have been working on this. And so it was that lack of education with the CSS caused the sort of technical debt, and then that lack of communication caused that technical debt. So you fix those two problems, you teach the developers the cascade and specificity and the fundamentals of CSS, and you teach them how to talk to each other properly. And then what the result is, the code base is very similar to what they already had. It's just cleaner, it's more organized, there's a refactoring route, there's a roadmap to do it. And they're all talking to each other and getting on better with each other. And you look back on them 12 months later, the UI is a lot cleaner, the UI is a lot less fragile. And it's that's the work. It's getting those fundamentals right to start with. And that'll just cascade, pun intended, with the CSS that you write to come with it. I think that's why a lot of developers struggle with CSS as well, because it's a language that requires so much sort of core skills in order to be proficient at it to start with.
Well, speaking of proficiency and somewhat of a segue, up to date, we've had some new changes in the world of CSS, some interesting things, some growth. I know I've been geeking out a little bit on CSS functions lately. What are some things that are top of mind for you as far as new things that have come out, or things that maybe are in your radar that people should be paying attention to?
So I've got a bit of a tendency of saying this is the best thing CSS has ever done to certain features. And the last time I said that was when flexbox came about. When flexbox came about, just complete game changer, changed everything, changed the whole way CSS worked. And then the more recent thing, I think, sort of recent thing was has. I was like, that's a superpower. That's something we've wanted forever. We've wanted to understand that parent-child relationship. We've always been able to go down, but we've never been able to go up in CSS. And then more recently, I think anchor positioning, just based on the stuff I used to do, like consultancy, like one of the most common problems was a sort of JavaScript-based anchoring system that was sort of quite fragile. CSS gives us that now, and the ability to say, if you collide on this side, then you can switch to the left side, or you can switch to the top, or you can switch to the bottom. So it's got all of these hints that you can give to the browser, because anchoring and sort of tooltips and toggle tips are very specific UI, but you can still now with CSS, with the new capabilities, say, I want you to be on the top. But if you can't be on the top, it's cool. You can be on the bottom too if you want. And worst case, you could even go on the left. So it's giving the browser this rule set and saying, do what you need to do based on this user's viewport, and then here's the rules that I want you to do. So I like to see that sort of try-catch methodology, I guess, with CSS, and I want to see more of it in the future as well. I think it's a really good way of building UIs.
Why hasn't Grid hit like Flexbox hit? I was reading a conversation about this on Twitter, and their remark was like, everyone latched onto Flexbox, it shot to 100% usage, and now everybody does what should be done in Grid in Flexbox. Grid just never seemed to catch on. Why? Why is that?
Chris Coyer said this on his podcast. He said he thinks it's WordPress, because the block editor in WordPress will basically like dump loads of Flexbox code, and then WordPress makes up like 40% of the web, so the numbers that are going to come from there. And I think I agree with him on that. I don't think it's a problem with the CSS. I don't think it's a problem with the Grid versus Flexbox as a feature. I actually think Grid's easier than Flexbox to understand. I think if you're like listening now and you're learning CSS and you can't decide which of those to learn Grid. And then Flexbox will actually make more sense to you if you learn Grid first. But I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons, is like the most popular delivery methods, so like WordPress and like other like site builders and stuff, they're using Flexbox because it's easier to do Flexbox in a programmatic fashion. The Grid, because Grid, I always describe Grid as like a higher order layout system. So you determine what the layout should be at the top, whereas Flexbox is more, the higher order layout is, I am a Flex container, and then the children decide what they need to do inside that element. And so there's a lot easier to do that programmatically than with Grid. So I think that's the reason. I don't think it's a case of people don't like Grid. I think it's the sort of like tooling-based CSS is just overtaking the hand authoring CSS on that front.
Interesting. Another topic that I think is interesting is memes. So one of the ones, well, I mean, I sort of say this for a point, because there's a meme out there that I used to relate to a lot. I think everybody did. And I'm not saying I ever really became a CSS expert, but in the project that I was discussing earlier, where I really got the deepest into it ever, the meme I ended up hating the most is the one of Peter Griffin with the blinds. Trying to do that, because it implies that CSS is arbitrary or somehow black boxy or mysterious and not deterministic. And I think that's what the one thing I was so thrilled about CSS to learn, was that it wasn't a fidgety thing that you just had to keep throwing things onto until it worked, that there actually was a logic. You could debug CSS, which was like the biggest mind blow to me many years into my career, right? I guess my question to you is, do you have either a favorite CSS meme or a least favorite one, and why?
I think it's that one. I think that's my least favorite one for the same reason. I think it just, all the CSS is awesome where it's breaking out of the box as well. Like, we don't have that problem anymore in CSS. That was a problem in CSS in like the early 2000s, more than like where we are now. But that one with the blinds is it's just disrespectful to CSS, I think, and it's a misunderstanding of how the language works. Like you say, it's not understanding what CSS is really powerful if you lean into what the browser's trying to do in the first place. If you're not trying to like strong hand it, and I think the people that relate to that meme are probably trying to strong hand CSS, and that's where you actually struggle with CSS, because it's not designed to strong hand like that. So you're going against what the language. It's like trying to make JavaScript, do all of the UI for you. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to do the interaction layer, and it's designed to do the logic. So I think that's really the root of where that meme relates to people is that, yes, CSS makes my life hard, and the reality is it's not making your life hard. You're making your life hard by trying to do things with it that it's not designed to do.
But along those lines, I think what's there is actually this idea that CSS is hard to debug. Like, have we gotten better at CSS debugging as far as the tooling goes? Like Firefox had a pretty good situation here, but I think that like it's a lot easier for people to throw a console log into their JavaScript code than like there's just no console log for CSS. It doesn't feel like. I mean, I guess the closest we get is outline red 1 pixel or whatever, right? But like
Classic, yeah.
the classic. But like, where are we with debugging in CSS? Are we getting better at it?
Yeah, I always said to like colleagues and stuff like, if you ever see magenta boxes on my screen, you know I'm in trouble, because that's how I used to debug CSS. Was I used to make like the problem area just magenta so it'd stick out over everything else, and then debug it like that. But that was the same time where I used to measure things with a ruler on my screen as well. So that's how long ago that was. And then like now, I think DevTools, especially Chrome DevTools, are unbelievably good for debugging CSS. Firefox is good also, because one of the things that I really like about Firefox is it'll tell you why a rule's not applying, like it'll explain it to you. And then Chrome's really good because they do also stuff like that. They very visually show you stuff. So like if you're using CSS clamp, for example, I was debugging this the other day, like I couldn't get a layout to work, and it's because my clamp rules were actually, when the browser calculated them, they were too close to each other, so it was just discarding them all. And it shows you that as well, so it's like crosses all the lines out. And Chrome, even now, will show you stuff like baseline and stuff like that in there. So I think debugging's gotten easier because the dev tools have gotten better, and I think that's the personnel that have been working in the browsers for over the last sort of 10 years, like Una and Adam Argyle, etc., like have really been pushing that like developer experience. Because, like you say, Rob, I think people think CSS is hard to debug, so they don't want to explore it and they don't want to get better at it. Whereas now that sort of tooling has caught up right in the browser, and yeah, I think now versus 10 years ago, it's night and day. It really is. Yeah.
I think it's less that CSS is hard to debug. It's more about it gets mixed together. So when you're doing things like, for example, Tailwind or other tools, and you're doing CSS inline mixed with your React code, you're trying to find the components. It's a whole thing that, especially at the junior level, but heck, I've seen seniors struggle with it where they're trying to find an item. It's often why I have always kind of followed a practice where the first line in your class names may end up becoming something unique to that, just so that way it's easier to locate if you're going through that problem. Especially when we're talking about massive code bases. Like I was working at a Fortune 500 organization where this was actually like a very big problem because everything followed their own guidelines, and it was the worst naming convention that I've ever come across. And so finding anything was a very unique experience. And so that was my way to combat a lot of that, where anything that I've worked on previously, I can easily locate because of that unique name that I gave it in the beginning. But when you're just dealing with vanilla CSS by itself, it's so much easier to locate what's going on, and especially debugging wise. But that kind of brings me now to the next point, I suppose. What are your thoughts on Tailwind versus vanilla CSS? Is there a way that you prefer to go with as opposed to another? I know that Tailwind has definitely gained a lot of steam. I'm a fan of Tailwind, but I also love doing things in vanilla CSS. I think both are phenomenal. Matter of fact, the website that I just released was all done in vanilla CSS versus Tailwind for a lot of reasons. I think maintainability over time and having an easier way to debug was definitely like a focal point of that, but I'm curious about what your stance would be on that.
I think you've summed that up really well. Like, what Tailwind is really good for is if you don't understand CSS very well, you've got a Figma design and your job is to make the website look exactly like that Figma design. Tailwind is going to give you an advantage with that because you're directly applying properties to every single element on the page. Like if you're building a native app interface, you don't get the benefit of the cascade or inheritance with an app UI there. So that, I think Tailwind works for engineers. Their main primary job is, my job is to write components to write logic, but now I've got to put a UI on it, and I don't really know CSS. So I think that's why Tailwind's really popular, because it gives you that safety that safety net in order to apply UI. The problem with Tailwind is it's an abstraction above CSS. The whole API can change, and the other thing is there's a lack of organization with it. It's very piecemeal the way that the UI is built. It's very specific. You're probably overriding yourself several times. You're probably introducing performance problems because of that. Tailwind's really good now versus what it was in its earlier days, where it generates utility classes on demand, which I think is really clever. I think that's a really good use case for it. My problem with it is that it's just too specific. It's what you're doing is like I was saying earlier, you're forcing the browser into doing things where you don't necessarily need to do it. And what I've found is people that have started on Tailwind is they don't even know that inheritance exists in CSS. So if you want to set the text to black in CSS, you just set the body's text to black, and then all the sort of text-based elements will inherit that color. Whereas people who came into Tailwind initially would set every single element color to black, even though that you constantly overriding that inherited style on there. So I think that's the problem with any sort of framework in front end is it's an abstraction layer above, but we can have the same argument about React and Vue and Svelte, where they're also an abstraction above the language as well. So if you come in from as a junior straight into React, you're going to miss a lot of that JavaScript education that would make React easier for you to write. And it's the same thing with CSS. If you understand CSS, Tailwind actually, the way you use Tailwind would be completely different. You'd actually probably apply a lot less utility classes, and you wouldn't introduce that technical debt that you might be doing otherwise. So I don't really have a problem with Tailwind. Although my reputation suggests that I do, but fundamentally, my problem with Tailwind has always been you're repeating yourself, and you're being too specific. I actually use Tailwind in projects, which always surprises people. I use them for utility classes and utility classes only. So if you just want to make text red in one situation that's sort of aside from the design system, Tailwind utility class does a really good job of that for you. But I can't imagine building a whole UI like that. But I think that's because I understand CSS. So I understand how it's supposed to work. And like you said, Danny, like your code's going to be more maintainable if you write the CSS as CSS to start with.
The wild part to me is just how much that the usage and the justifications for the usage of Tailwind have evolved over time, and I would argue have perverted over time. If you go back and read like the seminal blog post by Adam, but like as he was starting Tailwind, which is the discussion of why utility-based frameworks are so valuable, it wasn't to solve a problem in CSS. It was to solve an organizational problem of teams that use CSS. It was premature abstractions. It was about the fact that when you're dealing with designers, sometimes you get trapped in that pixel perfect world. So sometimes having a more finite palette of options for certain things makes it easier to both build and to re-implement UIs. Like, to me, these were organizational problems that were being solved. And I think what was funny is I don't know that there was ever the idea that Tailwind was there to satisfy a problem or simplify a complexity of CSS itself. But that's how some people have seen it now and turned into using it primarily as because it's easier than CSS, they say. I don't know if that's strictly true because, it's just like sometimes people don't fully realize that with Tailwind, like you can do everything you do in Tailwind in CSS. You can put those CSS properties right on those same elements.
Well, you can do more than CSS. You can do more than Tailwind with CSS, because with Tailwind you have to wait until the framework supports the new CSS capabilities.
Well, right, exactly.
Use it. Yeah. I think.
But that's not why they were using it, right? And I don't think that's what Adam would say why he's using it. I mean, I think most of the reason they have to clone CSS is just because there's this idea that if you're going to avoid the premature abstraction, you can't have situations where certain parts of CSS force you out of Tailwind. It breaks the whole thing that they've got going on. But I don't know if you were ever intended to be doing 99% of all of your authoring in that world. Like, it feels like it's an incomplete answer to the original problem. And I don't know if people realize that's why they're using it. I think they just use it because like it's very easy to pick up right off the bat. It's very straightforward, and then from there, like they don't really think what it's giving them.
Yeah, that's it. I think you summed it up. Funnily enough, though, Rob, all of those sort of problems that you sort of pinned as what Tailwind was supposed to fix, you can fix with core skills too.
No, exactly right. That's what
it.
It's a team problem, not a CSS. Yeah. CSS didn't have these problems. Teams using CSS had these problems, and Tailwind tried to fix those problems. But people think that it was there to fix issues with CSS, and I think it's kind of like, don't look behind the curtain. Like what you're using is more or less straight CSS. Often it doesn't. At least I haven't found it eliminates too many issues with core CSS. It was just that, like, if you've ever been on one of those spaghetti apps where somebody was off creating types and none of them really, the cascade's not being used effectively, and there's just things named differently all over the place, but they all collide with each other. Specificity's crazy all over, right? Who hasn't thrown up their hands and been like, I wish everything was just defined on the tags and I wouldn't have to worry about all this, right? But that's not a CSS problem, as you said. That's a team problem. That's a skills problem. That's a architecture problem.
It's the boring stuff makes things easier, and that's the thing. It's just the boring stuff, and it's the stuff that you not want to do. You come in as a developer, you don't want to be having meetings, you don't want to be in GitHub threads having discussions. You want to be writing code all day, and like those sorts of frameworks and abstractions allow you to do that.
I'll say I'm on record of being anti too many levels of abstraction. I say that every single time because I sometimes get comments about this. But with that being said, I don't necessarily know if the argument of using Tailwind because you don't necessarily know CSS is accurate. Because for me, at least, I still use Tailwind a lot. And it's mainly because the speed of execution. Or the other idea that I really love, and Rob touched on it slightly. I agree that Tailwind didn't fix something in CSS to a certain degree. It definitely fixed organizational issues. But one thing that I often think about is, for example, if you work in a massive organization with multiple teams, instead of each team creating a standard of their own, they're using one unified standard. But the other thing that I think about too is onboarding. So if I am bringing on new developers, their onboarding experience is significantly easier than trying to learn some proprietary CSS system that we've built. And so that's an industry level item instead of just an organizational one. And I think that just goes a step further in improving developer experience, because I've worked at organizations that did both, where they had their own CSS proprietary system, which I'll be honest was a nightmare. And then you had one where it was Tailwind, and getting into that code base, especially knowing the syntax and utilizing it in a regular way, significantly easier the path to get something out versus another one, and at least being able to contribute instead of having to learn this entire proprietary system that's put together with duct tape and WD-40 and they're trying to figure out how to make this work. That kind of goes a long way, I think, but I do give credit to the degree that I don't think it was solving many CSS problems as it was solving industry level issues of getting developers on the same page, which is why I really like it a lot, but the speed is just phenomenal.
Let me try and answer, Andy, and you see if you agree or disagree, because I want to try out this answer that I've given to people, which is that I've heard a lot from like people that are really big on like, oh, it's just pure CSS, and then you go and you look at their pure CSS, and all they end up having is like their component has a class, and the class is just my component 256. And it's proprietary CSS that will only ever be applied to that thing because it's not a reusable class. And my argument is, you did the same thing, guys. So there's this problem. Like, I agree with you, Danny. I'll use Tailwind a lot as well because it's really good for prototyping before I know, like, what are the classes that are reusable in my system. I don't want to have to think about it. And what people will often do is they'll just make a completely unshared class, but because the CSS isn't in the HTML, it's in a CSS file, they think it's like amazing, perfect, pure CSS. And it's like, guys, it's almost the same problem. I don't know, Andy, what do you think about that explanation?
So there's a lot. I'm boring, right? Because I come back with the same sort of answers each time. But the thing is, like, to fix those sorts of problems, you got those organizational problems like Danny's talking about. You got that proprietary CSS system. It's probably been born from years of different leads taking it in different directions, and it's just turned into this amalgamation of nightmare fuel. Tailwind would fix that immediately because, like, Tailwind is straight design token straight into the element. It works really well for that. And then there's the what you're talking about as well, Rob, where it's like you might as well be using Tailwind because of the way you're authoring CSS. The middle ground and the fix that I would always push people down is like, have a methodology that everyone can work around and that everyone that's documented. There's a process to it. It's part of your PR reviews. So BEM or the methodology, I create CUBE CSS, and there's like OCSS as well, and SMACs and all these different ways. They all actually fix the problem in a very similar way to each other. The important thing is that it's a consistency model. It's a decision making model as a methodology. So like the one I created was CUBE, so it stands for composition, utility, block, and element, and it gives all of these different parts of the UI a focal point and a decision-making process. So is it a layout? Yes. Okay, well, the layout should only ever worry about what child items it's got, and the child items themselves should never worry about their layout, for example. The layout is controlled for them by the composition layer, and then the blocks of the paint that you put onto the UI, so the specific user interface look and feel. The utilities do one-off jobs for you, for example. So you have all these specific decision-making models that you can come up with, and then you've also got something to reference in a pull request. So say, for example, in a pull request, someone integrates a lot of layout directly inside of a component. Then you can come back to the methodology and say, actually, a better way of doing this is to do a global composition, and then integrate that into the component instead. Then we can reuse that composition in the future. So you're giving the team and you're giving the developers that sort of organization structure in order to maintain a level of code. I think like the case that you were talking about, Danny, with the big horrible CSS system, that was probably born from an initial build of that code base where a CSS person probably might not have been involved in it, and CSS was just added. And then the thing about CSS is, because of the cascade, because of specificity, it becomes an append-only language quite easily, because what's the best way to get around it is to just put it at the bottom of the file, because you're going to at least get a boost from that. So going back to the drawing board, doing planning properly, and like what you're talking about there, Rob, Tailwind's really useful for prototyping like that, for determining like what are the components going to be, what are the like regions and more complicated modules going to be, using that prototype that you've built with a framework like that, and then saying, okay, this is going to help us now make decisions on writing the actual production level CSS code, and then actually having that mentality of, this isn't the finished product, this is going to be maintained, so we need to make sure it's easy to maintain in the future. And then again, that's where the methodology steps in, because it gives you that guardrail that you need, because CSS itself doesn't give you any of that for free. It's a low-level language.
Yeah. My takeaway from this discussion is that we need to properly assign the problems we face to the actual sources of them.
Yes.
CSS isn't the problem. Generally speaking, a lot of these frameworks are about solving organizational issues, the problems when teams have to work together.
Yeah, God help them, eh?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, we always think, right, the next best thing is going to fix all of our problems for us, right? Yeah. But then, we got to really look inward to solve those things. A framework can't save us from ourselves sometimes.
Instead of looking for a silver bullet, tackle the problem instead. Like, actually face up to the problem. And it might be hard and it might be difficult and you might fall out with each other during that process, but you look back on it 6 months later and you'll be like, I'm so glad we fixed the actual problem, rather than just trying to find another silver bullet to throw at it instead.
Awesome. Well, hey, very quickly, we found ourselves at the end of our conversation. Can you let people know where best they can find you and the things that you're doing online, in case they want to connect with you or track the things that you're working on?
I think the best place to find me in all the other places, because we are so fragmented now, is go to bell.bz, which is my website. That's also my Blue Sky handle, and I'm everywhere, and go to Piccadilly as well, which I think the best thing to do is put a link in the show notes for that.
Yeah, we definitely will.
But yeah, they're the best places to catch me.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that's going to be it for us today. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. Thanks to our guest, Andy. As we say, the conversation does not stop here. Follow all the links we put in the show notes to catch up with Andy and all the cool things that he's doing and learn all that awesome CSS. But as for me, you can find me online at RoboCell. For Danny, you can find him online at DThompsonDev. As for the podcast, you can find us online at moderndotweb.com or on Twitter at modern.web. As we close out, we would just like to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs, one last time, who would like me to remind you that This.is dedicated to guiding companies through their modernization and AI transformation journeys. This.Labs is a tech consultancy that specializes in amplifying your technical capabilities, whether it's expanding your dev team with seasoned professionals or streamlining your project's journey from ideation to deployment. We've worked with clients like Google, Microsoft, PayPal, and more. Find more about us at this.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co. All right, see you all next time.